Today we're continuing our series on evangelism, freely giving the gospel. And this morning we're discussing freely giving to friends. Last week it was family, this week it is friends. And to be honest, this particular topic is not something I'm either particularly natural at or particularly good at. I would say I struggle with this quite a lot. But that does make me uniquely qualified to think of a few reasons why we don't share the gospel to friends as much as we should or in the way that we ought to. So this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but it's a few things that came to mind as I was preparing for this talk and as I was reading this passage. So the first one is that we don't enjoy our salvation as we ought to. If we don't enjoy God, if the world is our source of satisfaction, then we'll feel no urgency about sharing the gospel with people who live in effectively the same way that we do, enjoying the same things that we do. As David prays in Psalm 51, "Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you." Moving on from that, we've lost sight of the depravity of sin. It doesn't bother us anymore. We may have sort of sanitized it. So if we forget how much sin offends God, or how awful it is to live in slavery to sin, then we will become completely okay about doing little or nothing to prevent it. Number 3, we can think our friends are doing all right. This might seem strange initially, but I don't know if you can relate to this. When I see someone who has nothing, who's on the outskirts of society, they're deeply lonely, they've got no hopes in this world as we might see it, then I find it very natural to think, I wonder how I can share the gospel with them. I wonder how I can show them God's love. But when I see a friend who is not a Christian, but by many accounts doing very well, living a reasonably moral life, they've got lots to look forward to, they've got a promising career, good wife, or I don't know. lots of promise in this life. Then I think, that maybe they don't need the gospel. So it becomes a lot less natural to think in that way. An obvious one, we are afraid of rejection or embarrassment. This one comes out of craving the approval of our friends, or rather fearing their disapproval. Another one, we won't know the answers to their questions. It feels like the world is moving so quickly with its philosophies and theologies that we just can't keep up. There's going to say something that we're just going to have no idea about. And it's possible that it's well-intentioned, that we don't want to misrepresent anything that the gospel says, but it's also possible that we just don't want to look stupid or deceived, so we won't share the gospel because we won't know the answers to their questions. And finally, the reverse of that is we'll know all the answers to their questions. So on the other side of that, it's possible to be so eager to intellectually outwit someone that we never actually get to the gospel. And that might be a strange concept to some of you. But an example might be feeling the need to deliver our 4-part lecture series on the reliability of Scripture before we actually quote a single Bible verse. And just as the last one was motivated out of a fear of looking stupid, then this one is often motivated out of a desire to look smart and willingness to look like a fool in presenting the gospel, as Paul says he did. So as I say, this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but I think each one of these, to a greater or lesser extent, is addressed in our passage in Romans 1. So if you turn to this passage, sorry, that's tiny. So you'll need your Bibles. I've chosen this passage in Romans 1. It's right at the start of Romans, the start of the sort of theological argument that spans the whole book. And at the center of this, not only this passage, but also, I believe, the whole book, or at least one of the central summarizing verses, is found in verse 16. It says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes." And I should say that I've taken just the first half of this verse rather. So it does go on to say to the Jew first and also to the Greek, which is an equally important statement to the message of Romans, but we just don't have time. It's only a 20-minute sermon. So we'll take just the first half, and I'll keep on coming back to it throughout the message. But first we want to understand it in its immediate context. So we see it starts with the word "for," so we want to understand why Paul says it. So we look at verses 8 to 14. And in these verses, Paul's love for the church in Rome is immediately evident. Paul starts by saying he thanks God for the church in Rome. He's delighted not so much by their numerical growth or any outward indicator of ministry success, but he's encouraged by their faith. Their faith is proclaimed in all the world at the end of verse 8. This is why Paul longs to see them. And it actually says that he prays without ceasing that he would somehow, by God's will, succeed in coming to them. And I often think of Paul praying without ceasing, praying for the Roman churches for their encouragement and their sanctification. And I'm sure he did. But actually what he's saying here, that he's praying night and day, please let me come to the Roman church, God. Please let me visit Rome so I can see these guys. So why did Paul so badly want to visit a church, most of whom, or perhaps all of whom, he'd most likely never met? Well, he goes on. He wants to impart a spiritual gift to strengthen them. He wants to be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. And he wants to reap a spiritual harvest among them. So if I took a survey of people talking about their closest friends and ask them, what is it you most enjoy about your relationships with your closest friends? I have a suspicion even many Christians would say something like, oh, well, they're easy to talk to. We have such a good time. We have such a laugh together. We're really on the same wavelength about this, that, or the other. And all of those are good things. But do you have friends with whom you can say, what I love about our relationship is that we impart spiritual gifts and strengthen one another's faith. We're mutually encouraged by each other's faith, and we reap spiritual harvest with each other. That's the kind of answer I imagine Paul would give, and that's why he's so eager to see the church in Rome. And this is the kind of friendship that helped David through when he was on the run from Saul. 1 Samuel says, David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness at Ziph at Horesh, and Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. This is the kind of friendship that helped David when he was experiencing a hardship that most of us will never face in terms of the level of severity. And this is the kind of friendship that Paul wants to cultivate among the Christians in Rome. The challenge here, as far as evangelism is concerned, is to ask that do we long for this kind of fellowship with our non-Christian friends? Or are we quite happy with our current relationships with them? And if not, then I could suggest that perhaps the reason that we are not so fervent in our desire for that is that we don't enjoy this kind of fellowship with one another. I would challenge us all to think, could this be said of Thornhill Church? That we are a church that is constantly imparting spiritual gifts to strengthen one another, that we're constantly and mutually encouraged by each other's faith, and we're always reaping harvests, spiritual harvests among one another. Now I have to say that I myself have been strengthened and encouraged by many of you over the years. So it's not an area that in which we're spiritually bereft. But we should always be seeking to grow in fellowship with one another, because from that will come the strength for our evangelism. But I would remind you all of verse 15, that the only way that this fellowship can be gained, and if we are seeking after this fellowship, the only way it can be achieved, whether with non-Christian friends or with one another, is through the preaching of the gospel. Look at verse 15. So I'm eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. God has given no other way, for the gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. This is why the preaching of the gospel was so central to Paul's ministry and evangelism. So I would challenge us, is it central to our ministry and our evangelism with our non-Christian friends? Sometimes we can console ourselves, I certainly can, with sentiments something like, I don't share the gospel with them, but they can see how I live. They know I'm a Christian. I don't share the gospel with them, but they know I go to church. And I don't want to discourage or diminish these good things, but they are not in themselves the power of God for salvation. And on their own, they won't save. As Paul reminds us in Romans 10. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And that is the challenge for all of us. So we see that the preaching of the gospel, we see why it was so central to Paul and to his ministry, and why he wanted to go to Rome. And this is why he says in verse 16, the key verse this morning, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes." We see that the reason here, I hope you can see that. If not, please be following in your Bibles. The reason Paul is not ashamed of the gospel is because he knows that it is the power of God for salvation. So do you dread sharing the gospel, or do you just hope the topic doesn't come up when you're having lunch with your old friends? Well, if you're ashamed of the gospel, then perhaps the reason for that is that you don't know it is the power of God for salvation. Just an example from my experience. In the past, I've been embarrassed about sharing the gospel, or I've sort of shared the gospel out of duty because I should, not really expecting anything to come from it, but at least if I've done it, I've done my bit. And that was sort of encourage a do the minimum approach to sharing the gospel. And the root cause of this was that I was doubting the gospel actually works. I was doubting that the gospel was the power of God for salvation. As Paul reminds the Colossian Christians, it is bearing fruit and increasing over the whole world, and it still is today. So if you can relate to the struggles that I've just described here, then I would encourage you to search the scriptures and understand how the gospel is the power of salvation. Understand how the gospel has been the power of God for salvation in your own life. If you're a Christian here, then Ephesians 2 verses 1 to 6 is a description of you, how you are dead in your transgressions and sins. You're following the course of this world, but not just that, following the power of the air, following Satan, but God being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. So do you know that? Do you understand the power of God for salvation in your own life? And if you don't, then that is why you are probably ashamed of the gospel. So we see from this passage in Romans and also this passage in Ephesians that if we want to understand the power of the gospel, then we need to understand two things. On the one hand, we need to understand the depths of our depravity and the wrath of God that rightly deserves. And on the other, we need to understand the depths of his mercy and his righteousness to us, because in there is hidden the power of the gospel. And if we diminish either of these, we will necessarily diminish the power of the gospel in our thinking. And that is when we become ashamed of the gospel. This is a challenge both theologically, in that there are many doctrinal errors we can make that diminish the power of the gospel. But it's also a challenge for our own hearts, in that we can believe all the right stuff, but if we don't believe it in our hearts, if we don't allow it to renew our minds and change the way we live, then we will diminish the power of the gospel. In each case, it's important to return to the Bible again and again, as the author of Hebrews reminds us. For the word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the division of soul and spirit, of joints and marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. So let's return to this passage in Romans and allow it to pierce our hearts. So Paul starts with, on the one hand, the righteousness of God. So Paul doesn't actually expand much on what he means by the righteousness of God in these immediate verses. But I think it's worth discussing briefly what this phrase could mean in light of other scriptures, in light of the whole counsel of God. And commentators actually suggest three possible meanings for this. So the first is the righteous. When Paul says the righteousness of God, he could mean an attribute of God. So part of who God is, namely his covenant faithfulness to us, his people. And you might look to somewhere like Daniel 9, where Daniel is contrasting the covenant faithfulness of God with the covenant unfaithfulness of Israel. And he says, "To you, O Lord, belongs righteousness, but to us open shame." So perhaps the righteousness of God is an attribute of God. It's also possible, as some argue, that it's God's righteous acts, God's work of salvation in sending his Son to die for us. And you might point to Isaiah 46, for example, which says, "I bring near my righteousness, it is not far off, and my salvation will not delay. I will put salvation in Zion, for Israel, my glory." So you can see Isaiah 46 is equating righteousness with salvation, both of those of God coming near to Israel. The third possibility is that perhaps the righteousness of God is the righteous status given to us by God. So if you look at somewhere like Romans 5:17, Paul says, "For if, because of one man's trespass, death reigned through that one man, much more will those who receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. So perhaps also this righteousness refers to the righteousness that is not our own, but ours through Christ. And I can't say I'm particularly initiated in this debate, but I along with many commentators, would see that all three of these are appropriate. None of them are mutually exclusive to one another. So we can look at the righteousness of God in this context as a combination of all three. The God who is righteous and faithful to his covenant people sent his righteous Son to die in our place, that we might gain his righteousness. As Paul summarizes in 2 Corinthians 5, for our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So with this multifaceted definition of the righteousness of God that we have from verse 16, we see that the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. So not only is faith the means by which God reveals his righteousness to us, but the revelation of God's righteousness produces in us faith. So here we get a picture of how faith grows in a Christian over time, over many years, through the ministry of the Holy Spirit. And we see that understanding God's righteousness is not really a case of having the right definitions or reading it in a book and then thinking, I get that now. It's something that, like faith, grows in the life of a Christian over time. And if we want to not be ashamed of the gospel, we should be continually striving to understand the righteousness of God in this way. And as we understand the righteousness of God more and more, we will become less and less ashamed of the gospel. But if we, that's on the one hand, we need to understand the righteousness of God, but also on the other, we need to understand the wrath of God and the depth of our depravity that incurs that wrath. So Paul continues in a comparatively detailed discussion of the revelation of God's wrath in verse 18 and following. So if we look at the latter half of verse 18, we see that those who don't know God, by their unrighteousness, suppress the truth. And let's remind ourselves that this is a description of not just us before we were saved, apart from the grace of God, but it's a description of all of our non-Christian friends, all of the non-Christians out there in the world. They are, by their unrighteousness, suppressing the truth. Now, this might be curious to some on a first glance. If every non-Christian is suppressing the truth by unrighteousness, does that not mean that every non-Christian already knows the truth about God? You can't suppress the truth if you don't know it. If you don't know the truth, you don't need to suppress it. So yes, is Paul really saying that every non-Christian, all of our non-Christian friends at work or from school, they all already know the truth about God? Well, yes, as he goes on to explain. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So Paul is saying here that God has clearly and majestically revealed himself in all creation, so that not just Christians, but everyone can see God's glory in creation. Everyone can see God in creation. As the psalmist says in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words, whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. It's rising from the end of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them, and there is nothing hidden from its heat. So just as nothing is hidden from the heat of the sun, so no one is hidden from God's clear revelation of himself in creation. Paul concludes from this, then, that they are without excuse. So this means that God is totally justified in his condemnation of the wicked. No unrighteous person can say, oh, well, I wasn't to know. No one ever told me. God told you, clearly and majestically, in creation. So then we can infer that if they are without excuse, we can infer that any reasonable person has all the knowledge that they need to know God. So why don't they? Why are there still any non-Christians in the world? Why don't all come to him? Well, as Paul says, by their unrighteousness they suppress the truth. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Because by their unrighteousness they suppress their truth, they are not reasonable in this sense, because they are denying the undeniable truth about God. So Paul describes them as futile in their thinking, verse 21. So if unbelievers are just wired to reject all reason before embracing the truth about God, then what can we possibly say or do to persuade them out of this intellectual fortress they've erected against accepting God? What could there possibly be to say or do to such a person? But the gospel is the power of God for salvation for everyone who believes. We see here the intellectual depravity that unbelievers are in, but also the power of God to bring them out of it. That this was us. We were in this state of depravity, but by the power of God, he saved us from it through the gospel. And this should be immensely encouraging to those who feel that they can't share the gospel because they don't know the answers to all the intellectual difficult questions that they may encounter. But if you know the gospel, then you know the power of God for salvation. And we shouldn't think of that as insufficient by any means. But it's also a warning to those who have such confidence in ability to intellectually demonstrate the existence of God, that they do so before sharing the gospel. Indeed, it's impossible to save a single soul purely by intellectually outwitting them, because intellectually speaking, they're already there. They already know God, but by their unrighteousness are suppressing that knowledge. So this doesn't mean, I want to clarify, that I think apologetics or answering tough questions is useless in evangelism, and that you should all throw away your copies of Confronting Christianity that you're doing with Stu. I'm very thankful that there are Christians out there who dedicate their time to destroying the arguments and lofty opinions raised against God. But we must be careful never to adopt an apologetic methodology that gets to the gospel eventually, that having first demonstrated this, that, or the other, will eventually then get onto the gospel, as though the problem of unbelief is primarily an intellectual one. But rather we should start with the gospel, always. Start with the gospel, start with the power of God for salvation, and with gentleness and respect, show how the answers to all of their questions flow from that central truth. Yes, Paul continues his discussion of the depths of our depravity in the following verses, and it's quite a harrowing series of exchanged statements. And what I mean by that is there's a series of statements that take the form: they exchanged A for B, so God gave them up to C. Hope maybe you can see that. I've highlighted the format there, but I've also got this table. So I'd encourage you to follow it along in your own Bibles, if you can. I need my Bible for this. So in verse 23 to 24, they exchanged the glory of God for idols. So God gave them up to the lusts of their heart. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up to the lusts of their heart, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. And then it goes on, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their woman, that's the next bit. So we see the truth of God for a lie, and God gave them up to dishonorable passions. And finally, in verse 26b, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women, and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men, and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind, to do what ought not to be done. And so we see Paul here describing what I see to be an escalating progression of depravity. So we see that not only are we, apart from Christ, and non-Christians, intellectually unable to even acknowledge God, even though he's clearly revealed himself in creation, we increasingly want to morally rebel against God's good created order, as we see throughout these verses. And it culminates in this description in verse 29 and following. It's, as Leah said, was a hard-hitting passage. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree, that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. So after such a harrowing description of our non-Christian friends, we might be tempted to ask, how could such a person in such intellectual and moral depravity possibly be saved? And the answer is the key verse in this passage. For the gospel is the power of God for salvation for everyone who believes. And we should meditate on this passage carefully, because if we diminish the depravity from which we have been saved, we'll necessarily diminish the power of the gospel that saves us from it. But if by God's grace we understand this passage, we understand the righteousness of God who saves us from it, then we will never be ashamed of the gospel. So my challenge for this week is that is just to meditate on Romans 1. Maybe read it every day. Ask God to open your eyes to the truths in this passage. Ask him to make you unashamed of the gospel as a result.